Hey everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is a follow-on from the previous one because I got behind, and if you've watched the previous one, you'll see that I said that I was going to be doing a couple of voiceovers all in a row just to get ahead a little bit, and then I'll edit them over the next couple of days and get them out. So we're still on the food prep, planning, preserving and all that, and we're into April before we go for the grocery haul. So it is only a few days away from half a week from when I go to the next grocery haul, but a week before I get back. So we're working through lots of stuff that's in the freezer, inventorying things and making sure that things get used appropriately and nothing gets wasted before we go on the next run. And that's the aim of these few videos that end up coming out before the grocery haul. They're the ones that are from getting the food hamper and using up the food in the food hamper, but also just inventorying the shelves and the pantry and using stuff that's left and assessing what we ran out of for the next supply run. So that, you know, a couple of weeks in the lead up to the next supply run is really about assessing how much got used and how much didn't, and what we need to top up and what we need to buy more of. And we're doing a bit more of that at the moment than normal because of the slightly longer period. So this shopping period, it was 7 weeks. By the time I get back, it'll have been 7 weeks. And the next one will probably be 8. We're just adjusting timing due to season. For a start, some of our fruit and veg will last a lot longer when it's cooler, but also just money because of the loss of income of the typing that used to be bi-monthly paid. So whilst we're compensating on that with other things, it's not paid as regularly as what my typing was. So now we're just going to have to reassess timing wise because of that to make up for it, which is fine. So this is the second lot of cooking in April so far. And again, we're just trying to use up what we've got, making sure that everything that is there is used before we refill the fridges and freezers. We don't ever empty them completely because the whole point of buying that little bit extra is that if I didn't manage to get to a shopping run, I didn't manage to go on a supply run, that we would get through an extra period of time. I'd like to think that we'd get through a whole extra period, but we wouldn't, not yet. But eventually we might get to the point that if I'm due to go on the supply run next week, and if I couldn't make it and there was a health issue or there was a transport issue or something, then if I couldn't get there till the next set time that I was going to go, that we would manage to get through. But at this point in time, we wouldn't. We do not have enough to get through that. We wouldn't starve, but we wouldn't get through. But if Darryl could get to town, then we could probably make do. It would just be a lot more expensive to do it that way. So this is the second part of April so far, and we'll get into it. So in the spirit of using things up, I went and going through the freezer. As I said, I managed to find a vacuum sealed bag of beef cuts from one of the trim boxes that I bought. So I didn't buy one last supply run, so it must have been the run before. And when I cut it all up and minced it and stuff, there must have been some extra pieces of fairly lean beef that I put aside to use at a later time. And so I found that in the freezer when I was reorganizing, and it was about 1.5 kilos worth of just pieces of beef. So the beef that I buy from a Costco comes in a box. At one point I went up to the door and I asked them if I could buy the beef that they turn into their mince from them rather than buying it as a mince. So it's boxes of the beef that they turn into mince, so it's exactly the same as what the mince is on the shelf. The only problem with mince is that it only really has a 24-hour shelf life. So once something is minced, you're supposed to use it within 48 hours. So by the time I get it home, it's one of those things that needs to be used straight away. And because I bulk cook with it, it makes it really difficult, and I don't want to freeze it when I'm going to bulk cook and then freeze it again and things like that. So I thought if I could mince my own, that would be great. The other thing with the mince too is that it always ends up leaking everywhere, because as soon as you compress the mince in those non-sealed containers, it bleeds all over the bottom of the eskies and stuff, so that was unpleasant. Whereas if I buy the beef trim from them, it comes in a box and it's variable. I've had a box from 12 kilos all the way through to 25 kilos, and it comes in 2 big vacuum sealed bags, which gives me a much longer period of time to use it and do what I want to do with it, turn it into mince or whatever else. So this bag was just chunks of beef that obviously when I've cut up the mince the beef for mincing. I've kept these bits aside because they were nice solid pieces of meat that could be used in a stew or something like that, and I'd put them in the freezer and I had forgotten it was there. So I diced it up into a bit smaller pieces. When we cut it up, it would have just been in pieces that were the relevant size for feeding down the mincing chute. So they were a bit bigger than I wanted for cooking with. It just would have taken too long to cook down. So I cut it up into a little bit smaller cubes just for using with this dish. I put it into a bowl to season it before browning it off, so a bit of flour, because this will add thickening to the filling for later, and as it cooks off in the oil in the pan, it gives this lovely nutty flavour, which we really enjoy. Some salt and pepper and garlic, a seasoning as well, and just coated all the beef. I put a generous amount of oil in the bottom of the pan and started browning the beef off in batches. The aim here is to get a bit of a seal on the meat, to cook off that flour, to cook off the seasonings and get some colour on the meat and in the pan. If you put too much in at once, it'll just stew in its own juices and it'll create lots of liquid, but you won't get those little sort of crispy charred bits, which is sort of what you're aiming for. You want those coloured bits because they add that flavour to what you're doing. As each batch cooks off to my preference, I pull it out into another bowl and then the next batch into the pot, adding more oil as needed to keep things nice and brown but not burnt as much as possible. So this was about 1.5 kilos of beef, so I did it in sort of 3 batches of 500 grams. So you don't have to do it in 2 smaller batches, as long as you get a nice wide bottom pot, but you do want to have it in one layer, basically, so that you're not creating too much liquid for it to brown off nicely. While I was cooking off the meat, I grabbed some dehydrated mixed mushrooms off the shelf. Get these big jars from Costco. I'm actually down to about 1/3 of a jar, and I don't think I've seen them the last couple of times. I'm going to have another look. I have seen that they had some different varieties of dried mushrooms. They had some morels and things like that, but they were very expensive. These containers of mixed mushrooms were quite inexpensive. So I filled a bowl with them and covered them with boiling water to soften up and rehydrate, to be added to the pot as we went along. They don't need to be completely rehydrated, but just to get them a bit softer will make it easier, and it means I can cut them up too if I want. Once all the beef was cooked off, I removed it all from the pot, adding another slug of oil to the bottom and adding the onions to cook. Now, I do have some small brown onions in a crate from a couple of hampers ago, but I got all these bags of frozen red onions from the hamper last month, and they're taking up a lot of room in the freezer. So I grabbed a couple of bags of those and used those as the onions in this. There is a mildly different flavour to red versus brown onions, in my opinion, but mostly only noticeable when you're eating them raw. When cooked, I kind of feel like they're much the same flavour. It doesn't really matter. I added a little salt to the onions just to draw the water out and get them cooking off a little quicker. Being frozen, they created quite a bit of their own moisture, so I sort of let them weep that off and get soft, and then I started adding things back in. They're not going to caramelise very well when they've been frozen and they've got that liquid, unless I went to a fair bit of effort, and I wasn't really that interested or invested. So I added the mushrooms and the water that I'd used to soak them into the onions first up, and then I started adding all the veggies. I have a bunch of these really large carrots. The bag of carrots I bought this month had a real lot of the really big ones in it, and the boys just tend to not to go to them for snacks because they're too large. If I cut them up into sticks, they will. So I will cut a whole bunch up into sticks and put them in the fridge, and then that way they will eat through them rather than them, just sitting there before I come back with the next lot. But the pigs adore carrots as well, so they will not get wasted. I can grate some up to freeze, but I don't know if I want to use the freezer space for carrots because they last so well in the fridge and things like that, but we'll see. And so I diced up half a dozen of them to go into the pie filling and added those. I grabbed a big bag of frozen zucchini from the freezer as well to go add as a good filler in there as well, and turned the pot down a bit, put the lid on so that the zucchini could defrost a little bit before, and we wouldn't burn anything on the bottom. Once I got that broken up, I added in the potato. Sometimes I add potato into the pie and then we have, say, 2 pies worth of filling instead of 1. Or sometimes I don't add the potato, but I serve the pie over mashed potato, and basically it ends up the same result, the same amount, except that by adding the potato into the pie, we end up with more of a pastry ratio. So by having 2 pies, we've got 2 lots worth of pastry on the pies, rather than having just the 1 pie worth of pastry served over the mashed potato. So I added the potato into the filling this time, and then added all the beef and any juices back in as well. I did add a jar of stock here. It will create a lot of its own moisture, but I'll reduce it a bit and add thickness if I want to later on. For some reason, I don't have on my notes here anything about baking the pastry, so I'm going to put a little, blurb in here, and hopefully I can find the footage to put it under there, because I obviously made pastry for these pies as well. I do a standard pastry. It is 400 grams of flour with 60 grams of lard and 60 grams of olive oil and 110 grams of iced water, and then I put all that into the Thermomix, and I bring it together into a ball stage, much like I do my pasta, and then I tip it out onto the mat and bring it together. And that batch of pie dough is enough to make a top and a bottom of short crust pastry for a family size pie, or to make, smaller ones. But generally speaking, I do that as a top and a bottom for a family size pie, or two bottoms if I'm making, sometimes I use puff pastry for the top of the pies. But if I'm using short crust pastry, which I tend to do on our family, like beef pie type things, then that batch will make a bottom and a top. So I made 2 batches of pastry. I have tried making it double the amount in the Thermomix. It does not work. Definitely need to make it in 2 batches, which is fine, and then bring it all together, put it into discs. I tend to make one disc slightly bigger than the other one for the base of the pie, only by like 40 grams or so, and then the base of the pie is easier to roll out and have the lip up the side, and then put them in the fridge for at least a couple of hours before I make the pies up, before I roll them out for the pies. For lunch, I threw together a bit of a savoury rice dish. I put a couple of cups of basmati in a pot with water up to the second knuckle, which is how I measure my rice for the absorption method. And I added some vegeta or chicken bouillon, whatever you want to use, into the water to make it sort of just a flavoured chicken rice. And put it on the stove. Once it comes to a boil, I turn it down to the lowest it will go and let it go for 15 odd minutes. Then I fluff it all up and I put it aside with the lid on for another 10 minutes just to absorb any of the last liquid. We had that rump in the fridge that I've been working through from yesterday, so I cut another chunk off of thin shavings off it and sliced it up nice and small. I cooked it up with the last of the bacon out of the fridge for the month. Actually, I think this bacon might have been bought in town, because we didn't have any bacon left that I wasn't sure of, so maybe we bought a bit extra in town, I'm not sure. But I had a bit of bacon there, so I cut that up with the beef. The beef cooking up wonderfully and tender, being that it was rump. Once that was cooked off, I removed it from the pan and I put in a dozen whisked eggs to scramble up. Once they were cooked, I mixed them through the cooked rice, added the bacon and beef in as well, a couple of tins of corn, some sesame oil, soy sauce, and served it just like that. Really simple but filling, and using the bits and pieces that I had available to make a meal. Once the beef was really tender in the pie filling as well as the veggies, I reassessed. There was a lot of liquid, and we wanted to reduce that a little to make sure that the pie crust doesn't end up soggy. So I added some seasonings, some of the homemade plum Worcestershire sauce, a generous amount, because it's much smoother than the store-bought stuff, and I think it has a much more complex flavour. It's really nice. I really enjoy it. And then a good amount of the Maggi rich gravy powder to thicken up the sauce, but also because, it tastes awfully good. I mixed that up and brought it back up to a simmer to cook the gravy powder. I ended up adding the end of the packet of gravy, of the container of gravy, because there just wasn't much left and it was still fairly liquidy, but then called it good. It will thicken up further on chilling, because of course we can't have pie this day because the filling needs to be chilled before we fill the pie with it. So the lid goes on till it drops in temperature a bit, and then I'll stick it in the bottom of the chest fridge. And then we will have pie tomorrow or the next day once it's fully chilled, so it won't create soggy pie crust. You want it cold, and it still will go a little bit more liquidy when you cook the pie, but it will, and my pies always tend to overflow a little bit, but it will be fine. I did mix up a batch of sourdough pasta after that. We didn't have any in the freezer. I wanted to use and feed my starters, so this was a good thing to make with it for a meal in the next couple of days. I added my standard ingredients into Thermomix: 3 whole eggs, 100 grams of starter, 60 grams of olive oil, and 400 grams of plain flour, and brought it together into the small balls with the food processor Thermomix style blade. And tip it out onto my dough mat, brought it all together into a ball, put it in a Ziploc bag, and it will sit on the bench for at least a few hours, either being rolled out or put in the fridge to be rolled out within the next day or two. And then that way I've got it on hand for a meal some point over the next few days. I did find a tub of Nuttalex in the fridge that I didn't know I had, and the kids were after some baked treats. So Nuttalex works as a great alternative to butter in a lot of baking. It's not, you know, the healthiest item, but it's really not the worst either. I do make my own dairy-free margarine, and I would prefer to use it, but I just haven't been keeping on top of that kind of thing lately, and this works really well for when the kids want to bake, because it's just a really easy one-for-one swap in recipes, and it lasts ages in the fridge, so long as you don't contaminate it anyway. We have had some go bad because children have like used dirty knives in it or whatever. And I do have a tendency to scoop some out of the big 2-kilo container into a smaller container for them to use on bread and things like that, and that way there's less extra matter that ends up in the tub. Susan sent the kids a cookbook for teenagers, and the kids have been baking lots out of it. They did waffles the other day, though they had an interesting aftertaste because Sonnet didn't realise that baking soda or bicarb was different to baking powder. They made banana pancakes the other day too. They even made a risotto, though I did give them my recipe so they could use the Thermomix rather than doing it on the stove, but they have been doing a lot of baking lately. Anyway, baking wise, I've made on the channel before the Edna's lemon curd tea cake, which we all love, but it's a few steps and it bakes well in a smaller round tin, so I wanted something similar but a bit more adaptable for quantities. So I fiddled with that recipe and a couple of others, and definitely got something that's similar but not quite the same. I wanted to use my square brownie tins, though I could even probably use the slightly elongated tins as well and get a few more serves out of it. I forgot though that I should have put them on racks on trays or something. The bottoms of the cakes did get a little bit burned because they're a fairly long baked cake, and being in the barbecue you've got bottom heat only. Whereas if I had to put them on trays with racks on it, that would have done a bit more circulation of air and it wouldn't have been quite as much of an issue. But they worked fine. I did one big batch for the bases, and it's sort of a cross between a slice and a cake recipe. I'm going to make it again and make sure it works, and then I'll share the recipe because I didn't keep very good notes. There's a lot of scribbles there, and it was trying to figure out the ratios that I needed to line the bases of the trays, and then I can give you the measurements of the trays and things like that. So I did a big batch of the batter or the dough for the base, pressed firmly into the tin, and then I put a layer of whatever I wanted. So for one, I had a jar of my dairy-free lime curd, and the other one I used a jar of cinnamon apples off the shelf that I had drained. I mixed up the same amount of dough or batter again. I did use a portion of that for the base of the second one to fill the tin, though it could have been a bit thinner possibly and would have worked better, but again, as I said, I was fiddling with this, so I can't really share the recipe until I know what works. And then I used the rest of the dough as a crumble type topping. Now, I personally would like some coconut, maybe some slivered almonds, but I know that Darryl, for one, prefers it without, and I think some of the kids would like and some wouldn't. So I'm going to give it a go with those extras in the crumble, but these ones I just did plain. I also think a layer of jam in there would work quite well, as if you wanted to use something else as the middle, like a layer, even the plum jam that I made or something like that. So this could be a really nice versatile recipe that once I get it right and I can write it out, Sonnet and Apollo can cook whenever they want as well. And I like things done in slice pans and cut up because it just makes serving it so much easier. So I crumbled all the extra dough over the top of the pans and then put them into the barbecue. This is what they looked like when they came out. As I said, there was a little bit of burning around the edges because the pans shouldn't have been directly over the heat, but that's fine. It's not an issue when I use my cast iron pans because they're heavier, but when I'm using like these non-stick steel or aluminium lighter weight pans, then if it's got a decently lengthed bake, it definitely causes issues. The base is a lovely cross between sort of a biscuit and a cake, a slice and a cake, and then that layer of flavour and the crumbles on top. The kids ate the lime curd one very quickly. Darryl actually wanted a slice the next night and there wasn't any left. So, but they did eat the apple as well, so that was a well-received snack. It all got eaten quite quickly. So another good use up of things that were in the freezer that needed to be used. So that beef that I had there that I had forgotten about, and because I'm going to buy a new box of beef trim this month, it's good to get that out of the way and used, and then we'll have fresh stuff for using for this month and the month following, because as I said, I generally only buy one of those boxes of beef trim about every second supply run. So we got that out of the way. Pies are always something that's well received, though I didn't show the pie here, obviously, which I will show it in the next video because I think it was a couple of days. I think in the end I had a few things defrosted. I'd pulled a few things out of the freezer that needed to be used, and the pie filling could sit in the fridge for a couple of days before it was used in the pies. So I will show those in one of the next videos, the actual pies made up. I even made a little individual one. Darryl requested a steak and cheese pie, though I used our dairy-free cheese, and he said it wasn't quite the same, but it was still kind of neat. So there's those. And the slices, the cake slices, we've made them a couple of times since this video, and I will get them out as well because they're working out really well with a variety of different toppings. Lots of things that I've got canned on the shelf that need to be used. I do have a fair few apples, and they're actually from 2 seasons ago because I ended up with so many, and I just found that I didn't end up using them as much as I would like because we just don't eat pies and pastries and stuff that often. I should make them more often because everyone would eat them, but I just don't tend to. So being able to use them in things like this or cakes and that sort of stuff works well as well. Like doing them in the dough scrolls, and there's an apple custard one I used to make too, but again I just don't make that much of that sort of thing, though I am trying to be better about it because it would help with the kids to have the snacks available. So I'm trying to sort out our timing a little bit better so that I have like a day where I spend a day or 2 mornings or whatever where I do a bunch of baking each week to sort of top up the stocks of the baked goods that are around, but we're working on it. So I will share those once I get the recipe right for those. And yeah, so that was another couple of days of using up stuff that was in the freezer that needed to be used, cleaning things out, and still making good meals with stuff that we have available. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye guys.